value, religious, mystical value and importance of, human sexual secretions. And, here it is not very, I'm speculating here, but my comparison draws on the analogy between the use of, let's say, human sperm and menstrual vaginal blood. And we know from the study of Eastern Tantra, of Indian Tantra, that several schools of tantric orientation have assigned mystical and magical value to both men's sperm and female menstrual blood. Importance attached to the value of the semen sometimes is translated into actual practice by the insistence on celibacy. And there is a very prominent idea among certain yogic schools, particularly the Siddhas, that one should not waste one's semen, and that to do so lead to old age, disease, and ultimately death, and that instead one should preserve one's sperm. And not only that, there exists very prominent yogic and tantric tradition in which it was assumed that sperm originates in the brain or in the highest chakra within the human body, and that in the process this semen, this sperm, which is while at the top of the head has the quality of the elixir of immortality, it slowly drips down through the spinal column, and then it gets devoured or burnt by either digestive fire, or it gets released from the body, which was a negative consequence in the sexual act. For this reason, not only is human semen sperm supposed to be contained within the hermetically sealed yogic body, but also the yogis and tantrics are attempting to establish the return of the semen from the lower position around the genital organs, to establish the rising upward movement of this sperm until it reaches back its origin at the top of the head, and by which process then it again becomes elixir and ambrosia. So there are ways in which this is possible to be done by doing certain muscular contractions, by practicing certain kind of breathing, and also by engaging in a certain manner of visualization, in which you attempt to make possible the return of the semen, or the bindu, to use the technical term, from the position at the base of genital organs up to the top of the head, to the highest chakra, where it becomes the elixir.
And you're relating that to the Gnostic Mass, as in
and
from the
in the
priest.
Gnostic Mass we see something similar, that ultimately it all culminates in the mingling of the symbolical substances, bread and wine, and then the symbolic registers of bread and wine, cake of light and the wine, would correspond to the sun and moon, male and female, gold and silver, etc., etc. So we have mingling of these substances that is also happening at the high altar, which symbolically represents the top of the head, because the temple in which the Gnostic Mass takes place is symbolically patterned on the structure of the human body, and the altar at which the priestess sits and at which the mingling of the bread and wine takes place also would correspond anatomically with the top of the head. So in this instance we might speak about a parallel between the dynamics symbolic register of the Gnostic Mass and certain yogic and tantric teachings. By which I'm not necessarily saying that Crowley was, at the time of writing Gnostic Mass, informed by the tantric teachings and that he just translated them into the Western ecclesiastic ritual. I'm not saying exactly that, although this is quite possible. My argument is that there is a parallel, that there is a correspondence between these two ideas, practices, and notions.
Anybody who's studied Crowley knows that the Gnostic Mass is the symbolic representation of kind of the more deeper or meaningful secrets that are within the OTO higher degrees. So, from your research, do you see direct correlations between the information that is available that's taught about the higher degrees in the OTO and tantric practices that are found in the East?
Well, to my understanding, there is a correspondence and there is analogy. The problem is that both tantric text and the OTO text on this subject are written within a certain symbolic register. They are usually not expressed in an open language, but they use certain symbolic imagery. So, for that reason, it is rather difficult to establish parallel on certain ground, on certain terms. However, it seems to me that functional and meaningful parallel does exist.
Can you explain some of the parallels that you see between Tantra and the OTO system that you know of?
Well, at the most obvious level, based on what I have read and based on how I understood what Crowley wrote about the notion and value and importance of the semen or the bindu and its the importance of its mingling with the menstrual blood, these same ideas and practices do exist in India. In some cases, in some schools of Tantra. In some cases, the subject of the Tantric theory and practice is a solitary practitioner, where all of this is transposed onto a bit more meditational and symbolical level. And also, we do know that there are instances and cases where the actual sexual union between male and female practitioner takes place. We also know, especially, and this is especially true of the Bauls of Bengal, which is a syncretic movement that incorporates elements of both Hindu and Muslim mysticism, that they place especially high value on the menstrual blood. In fact, according to their understanding, according to their system, it is the woman that is the carrier of the elixir of immortality, and men can access it only by having intercourse with a woman, or by ingesting and consuming orally the menstrual blood, within which there is this carrier of the immortality and also of gnosis. So this is on the one hand that just at the level of physical practice, or at the level of corporal practice, while we are speaking about actual physiology, about actual substances, that there is a certain similarity, certain deep similarity between what Crowley and OTO taught about these things and what we find in some tantric teachings. But in addition to this, perhaps even more important is that both Crowley and tantric teachings that deal with sexuality, and by the way, tantric teachings do not deal only with sexuality, so sexuality is only an aspect of tantric teachings, but to the degree that they do speak and they do take notice of sexuality, in both Crowley and Tantra there is this understanding that the power of sexuality is transformative power, that it is able to produce a certain kind of ecstasy that does start from the bodily experience and does take into account the bodily experience, but the flower of that experience is a spiritual insight, spiritual experience, and that is the perhaps the most important aspect of that all.
Well, in your paper, you go from talking about the tantric aspects in particular, and then you start going into the Sheffilu period, and talk about Crowley actually kind of putting some of these tantric elements of practice into the praxis of the group. Can you touch a little bit on that, some of the things that were done within the group, and some of the results that he obtained?
Well, again, this is largely my own interpretation. It is not very often that Crowley would use tantric vocabulary when talking about these experiences, except that he very often uses technical vocabulary related to most often he uses the term bindu for the semen, which is kind of typical tantric term for the semen, and occasionally also he would use occasional Hindu words or Sanskrit words for certain experiences such as samadhi or whatnot. But my understanding was that although it is highly disputable whether Crowley was consciously trying to implement some tantric teachings during the Sheffilu period, however, in my understanding, in my interpretation, it seems to me that there is a very clear parallel in what he and the group around him were trying to attempt at the Sheffilu, and certain deep and important and meaningful aspects of tantric teaching in general. And here, I mean, in both instances, transgressive nature of the tantric teachings and the transgressive nature of some aspects of Crowley's teaching and practice.
What do you mean the transgressive nature?
Yeah, well, that is kind of rather interesting and an important aspect of this all. When I use this term transgressive, then I am kind of invoking a certain binary opposition between the ordinary life and the life that is typical of mystical or spiritual or initiatic aspects of life, understanding of reality, and the value of transgression in religion, in mysticism, is usually such that it is able, transgression is able to shatter the image, whether self-image or image of reality, understanding of the world, to shatter it in such a way that new and broader and deeper understanding of both self and the reality is possible. So here the assumption is that the ordinary life, Crowley and Tantrics would often, while talking about ordinary life, talk about life of non-initiates or people who are not initiates, not necessarily in a technical sense, but in a bit more meaningful and spiritual sense. So there is this dichotomy between the life of an ordinary Joe, or in Tantric teaching, ordinary person is usually called Pashu, which just means animal or a beast. And life of such ordinary person is usually, I'm not being very clear. We all have a tendency to form definite image and understanding of both ourselves and the world that surrounds us. We do have a certain image of reality that is comforting and that is functional in our everyday life. However, we all know from our own experiences that ultimate reality transcends this picture, this convenient and conventional understanding of both self and the others. And sometimes it is possible to transcend this ordinary and limiting